So give us your name.
My name is Frederick A. Hodnett Jr. That's spelled H-O-D-N-E-T-T, Hodnett. I was born March 12, 1944, so I've just had my big 70th birthday. My parents were Frederick Andrew Hodnett and Mary Catherine Copenhaver. My father is deceased and my mother is deceased. My father was from the Chatham, Pennsylvania County, Danville area, and my mother was from the Abingdon, Washington County area. I was in fact born in Abingdon, Virginia on that March 12, 1944 date during the World War II time when my mother, who was a school teacher, had gone back home to have me while my father was away at the war. I was reared from about age 1 until 15 in the town of Dublin, which is Pulaski County, Virginia. And at that point, at age 15, I went away to a boarding school. I have one sibling, Nancy Preston Hodnett Roberts. She is 3 years younger than I, and she lives in Durham, North Carolina. At age 15, I went away again to a military school, a place called Hargrave Military Academy in Chatham. That's where my father was from, and that's where he had attended while he was a boy in that town. Upon graduation from Hargrave in 1962, I elected, I had several choices, but I elected to attend the University of Richmond, where I had a wonderful 4 years and spent the years 1962 to 1966. I graduated from University of Richmond in 1966 and was fortunate enough to be admitted to a law school at University of Virginia, which I attended from 1966 to 1969. It's hard to believe, but I just about 2 weeks ago attended my 45th law school reunion, so you can tell I am getting older. But I looked as good as any of the ones that came back, I can tell you, and I'm still here, so that's the good news. I was ROTC commissioned at the University of Richmond in 1966. I was able to be deferred. That was, you recall, the 66 to 72 was the Vietnam War era. But even though I was deferred and I was fortunate to be able to finish my law degree, I could not avoid my 2-year obligation, which I submitted to and which I was contractually obligated to do. In the military, I was went through 3 schools beginning in January 1970, Fort Knox, the then intelligence school, which was, or some would say the oxymoron school, military intelligence in Fort Holabird, Baltimore, Maryland. And then I was language tested and sent to a Vietnamese language course in Fort Bliss, Texas. October 1970, October 71, I spent 1 full year to the day in the Republic of Vietnam as an intelligence officer, specifically as an interrogator in combat intelligence. And I was sent home in October 71 and released to the reserve program. My formative years were very interesting, I think, and very, for the time, somewhat idyllic, because the 1950s and early 60s was, at that time, a pretty normal time for most of us in the United States. And I grew up in a small town and had lots of friends and acquaintances. And we didn't know at the time the dangers that lurked out there, and we were very carefree. My mother, Mary Catherine, a school teacher, regrettably became ill in her 37th year and succumbed to a kidney disease. And so I was 13 at the time, and she passed away. And my dad was a single parent for about 3 years. He did remarry. My stepmother, whom he married in 1959, her name was Elizabeth Marshall Allred Hodnett, and she actually was from 1959 to 2006 when she passed. She was my mother for all intents and purposes, and a wonderful person, and had the pleasure of knowing her as mother much longer than I had my real mother. After law school and the Army, I started looking for a job, and I had not, unfortunately, passed the bar at that point because in the days I was in law school, you took your bar in the middle of the third year, and UVA was a wonderful school, but it did not, at that time, and still does not prepare people for Virginia law. It's sending its top-ranked people to New York and to San Francisco and to London and places like that. But I'm not making them the reason for my not passing the bar. But suffice to say, I came back 4 years later needing to pass the bar, particularly since my first job I landed here in Richmond was in banking. I worked for a trust department of First and Merchants Bank, which is now morphed eventually into the Bank of America. It was down here at 9th and Main Street. And just by chance, I ran into Mr. Bennett at a dinner one night. We were both out having dinner, and the gentleman, we just had casual conversation, but he was befuddled, I guess you'd say, by the fact that he'd been in this position of executive secretary since 1952, and all of a sudden the legislature, which has the power to create a court system, had reorganized the courts, and he was being given the daunting challenge of administering as the executive secretary of this mega court system, which would include everything from the Supreme Court to the circuit courts to the new district courts, and now to the transition of the justice peace into the magistrate system. And just in casual conversation, he said, Fred, I'm looking for somebody to help me with this. And I said, that sounds like a challenge, Judge Bennett. Keep me in mind. Not thinking for a moment that would go to anywhere. Well, the next day I get a call at the bank from Judge Bennett up here at the Supreme Court saying, can you come up and talk to me a little bit more in detail and meet the Chief Justice? I said, of course I would. I'd be honored. So I came up and had an interview at lunch one day with Mr. Bennett, the then Chief Justice, who was the first one to hire me, Harold Fleming Sneed, and his assistant, able assistant at the time, Harry L. Carrico. And maybe they didn't have a lot to choose from, but they called me to come to work. And I was honored, and the only requirement was I had to be a member of the bar. So now the pressure is really on. I've got to get that bar exam. So I gave my 2 weeks notice at the bank. In faith, took the bar review course. This time I took it at the University of Richmond, which was well known for getting people in Virginia past the bar exam. It was the old style bar exam. It was not the multi-state exam we hear about now. It was the traditional 40 questions, 2 days bar exam. And I know in retrospect why I probably didn't pass the first time. I thought you wrote a bar exam like you did a history exam. You wrote a blue book full. But I found out later these bar examiners are grading 1,000 papers, and they're looking for a key word or a key phrase. So I learned my lesson the second time, and hopefully with faith I got the right answer. I just put the phrase and 2 sentences, whatever. And by God's good fortune, I passed. So I came to work here July 1 of 1975. Let me get back to where it really happened. July 1 of 1973. 75 is when Rob came. 1973, July 1 of 1973 is the key date. That's when I started working. That was the date of the effective date of the Court Reorganization Act. And as I said, I passed, and they let me stay. And I told friends of mine, I said, you know how poorly bank jobs pay when I went to the state for more money. Because at the time, neither one of them paid very well, but this one paid enough better that I thought this was a good move. But not just for the move, but it was a challenge which I really, really look forward to dealing with. And then I spent a career from 1973 until 2006, when I retired July 1, 2006. So I guess I'm a member of the 30-year club. Anyway.
Well, we're going to drill down to some of the things that you mentioned because it's a fascinating, I'm hesitant to say life because you still have many more years ahead of you, but an experience so far. So let's start with your parents.
Okay.
Exactly how did they meet, and do you remember when they were born?
Yes, I do remember when they were born. My father, Fred, was born August 13th, 1913 at Hodnett's Mill in Pittsylvania County. He's deceased. What I know about him is from talking to my family members who were there. Interesting enough, his family consisted of four, a brother and two sisters. His eldest sister, Mary Hodnett Matthews, is 104 years old and still living. Wow. I'm hoping I got some of her genes, those genes. But my dad was born August 13th, August 15th, 1913. August 15th, 1913. My best friend was August 13th. I have to always remember that. My dad grew up in Chatham. His father was a constitutional officer. He was sheriff of Pittsylvania County, and that was a fairly important position at the time. Pittsylvania County was, at the time, the largest geographically sized county in the state. I think annexation in 1970-something reduced it a little bit because Danville, the city, got some of that, and so I think Augusta County is now by a little few square miles, the largest county. But my dad grew up in the town of Chatham, went to the former Chatham Training School, which is now the Hargrave Military Academy, went away to school to VPI at first. He was in the old, I guess you'd say ROTC program, Corps, at age 17. He survived that, but his brother, James, who was a year and a half older, was attending North Carolina College. Now that has now become North Carolina State University of the University of North Carolina. Mm-hmm. So my dad transferred his second year to NC State, where he was graduated. I believe it was 1936, but I'm not exact about that. But he majored in forestry and agronomy, and that's where his career led. He was. This was during the Depression period, and he was fortunate to get a job after college. But he was with the old CCC camps in Georgia and North Carolina, and ultimately was hired and spent his career with the United States Department of Agriculture as a soil conservationist agronomist. He had a 3-county area where I grew up, which was Pulaski, Giles, and part of Montgomery County, and he also had an agronomy assignment at Virginia Tech, which was about 20 miles away. But he, despite offers to go other places, he was a homebody, and he spent his career pretty much there, and retired in the late 70s and lived his retirement years there in the town of Dublin, and died in 1991.
So what kept him there was his family?
His family. Yeah. Remember, my mother had, well, I didn't say the year, but she passed away in '57. So I went away to school. My sister stayed in the town and went to the schools and graduated from the local schools. My sister subsequently went to Longwood University, where she became a school teacher. Now, so I would say my father's homebody nature and the fact that he was in a good situation as far as rearing a family, and it was a good place to raise a family. I think that's probably why he stayed. He did marry my stepmother in 1959, and she was a native of North Carolina herself, a place called Dobson, which is near Winston-Salem. But she had spent her career in Washington, actually working for the Department of Agriculture. There was a long story about how they had met earlier. It was when he was doing CCC work in North Carolina, and he met her as a young lady, but didn't obviously get with her. But later, after he lost mother, he reacquainted and they got together.
Now, your father went to a military academy.
Yes.
That you went to.
Right.
And you had mentioned that in the county, he was born in a place.
Pittsylvania County, spelled Pittsylvania. The county is named for an English title,
Right.
William Pitt, Earl of Chatham.
Right. Now, but you also mentioned Hodnett's Mill.
Hodnett's Mill was the local, it was their homestead.
So is this your family's name?
Yeah, yeah.
And so
Hodnett,
you all descended from
Yeah.
a very prominent family.
I don't know how prominent, it's got English roots. My Aunt Mary, the 104-year-old, is a genealogist, and she traces the first Hodnett to 1730s in Buckingham County, Virginia. And they spread out through the Piedmont area, basically. So I don't know how prominent. I hear Hodnett is a Teutonic word. The hod is a piece of steel, and the net is like blacksmith, Hodnett. You know, it's one of those English derivative names.
And because your father went to a military academy, then that suggested that he was raised in an environment that prepared young men for leadership.
Right.
And so was that a family tradition even before him?
Again, the sheriff, the grandfather, and I never knew him, he passed in 1938. I guess it was considered a leadership situation, an elected official. My dad was of the demeanor that he didn't seek public office or any sort of leadership. I mean, he fulfilled his job, his day job, if you will, I think professionally, but I don't think he ever sought any limelight or anything of that sort.
Did you also seek to go to the military academy, or was that expected?
I think it was expected. My mother and father had planned for me to go anyway, but with her passing early and his dealing with being a single parent, I think it probably was the time he thought it would be good for me to go, and he could tend to home with my sister, and he hired a housekeeper to help him with the duties. But I think the answer was I was expected to go. Not maybe for the leadership thing, but just to fulfill their wish for that. And the public schools where I was from at the time were not particularly strong. I think there was another motivation. He was hoping to get me into a little stronger academic, challenging area.
So when you were growing up, did you find yourself attracted to a certain career path, or did you have special hobbies that you enjoyed?
I was not very athletic. I mean, I was athletic enough, but I was never, in a small town, sports is such a big issue. I was not a member. I mean, I swam and I did a few things like that. But my mother, who I haven't talked about yet, was quite a good person and very much a civic-minded person involved in things as well as teaching. I think the role the model was sort of her, not my dad, as far as that was the issue. I did well academically, both in the public schools and then at Hargrave. I was fortunate at Hargrave to be the valedictorian of my class. But
Did you have a favorite subject?
I liked English, and I liked government, which I ended up doing. But quite honestly, when I went to college, I thought I was going to maybe be a doctor. But I learned very quickly that chemistry and labs were not my thing. In fact, my roommate and my fraternity brother ended up being a doctor, and I just know he used to call me the lamb, liberal arts major. He would spend his waking hours in the lab, and he was a brilliant guy. Unfortunately, he is now deceased himself, but no, I think probably government or some sort of academia was probably where I was best headed. I originally thought that I wanted to be a teacher, and that's such an honorable profession, but it's like everything else, economics dictates so much of our life, and after I got over the doctor idea that I wasn't going to be one, I then set my sails toward a law school. But then again, I don't think I thought practice like everyone thought at the time, but I really wasn't fire in the belly to be a prosecutor or anything of that sort. So I thought, well, maybe I'll get into some corporate kind of law. And that's sort of why the banking thing came there in the beginning. But it was fortuitous that I got this position because I was able to get the academic piece of the government, the political science, if you will. I did a fair amount of writing here and orders, and so knowing English and syntax and all that was very important. And also, one of my roles that I played was helping with the education program. So this job that I ended up getting really combined all of that.
So let's go back to your mother, since you mentioned
Okay.
that. Tell us a little bit about her family background.
All right. My mother, Mary Catherine Copenhaver, and that's spelled Copenhaver. It's a good Pennsylvania Dutch name. The Copenhavers migrated from the Pennsylvania Dutch country. If you look at the map, I-81 is the path down to Western Virginia and Tennessee. She was born December 19th, 1919. And my memory is a little vague about some of hers because of her dying so young, but I do know enough about her family. Her father, Sam Copenhaver, and my mother, Jenny Lou Preston Copenhaver, were dairy farmers in Southwest Virginia. And that was a very common thing. They owned land, they raised cattle, they milked cows, and they worked very hard. Again, they were products of the Depression era. My mother went to a one-room school, if you will, in Washington County, Virginia at the time, and she was very determined that she was going to get an education. There was no money really to do it. She attended a very nearby school called Emory and Henry College, which is a Methodist school. She was reared, her dad was it was one of those split things. Her mom was a Presbyterian and he was a Methodist, but you know, they worked it out. Sort of like my son and daughter-in-law. My son follows UVA and my daughter-in-law is a big VPI person, but they coexist. My mother attended Emory and Henry and was a good student and majored in English and Latin. You could do Latin at that time. That was one of those classics that you sort of got through. My mother and father were married in 1941.
How did they meet?
All right, good question. My mother, after college, secured a teaching position in a place called Gretna, Virginia, which is in Pennsylvania County. She was about 20 miles south. She was boarding at my grandmother's house, Mrs. Hodnett, in Chatham. I can't but just imagine what the war years were like. There were just people transplanted everywhere. So my dad, who was then at the time in North Carolina came home. He was single at the time, and he was checking on his mother. And I think he met her when he came up one weekend from North Carolina and met her. My mother, I was told, was already engaged to be married to another gentleman from Emory and Henry, and who was trained to be a minister. They did pre-ministerial out there too. And I never met him, of course, but I heard his name. But apparently all bets were off, and they met and were married in January of 1941. That's, of course, when the war was breaking out. And my dad went into the Army, and I believe he was in the Signal Corps, but because of his deployments, he had to be in various places, not with her. So she became pregnant with me, and I guess ended her teaching in Gretna and went to her parents' home in a place called Glade Spring, Virginia. Lodi, no, that's 2 stores, so you would not find it on a map. But March 12, 1944, I was born in the hospital in Abingdon, Virginia. He was away at the time. So I think he was released in 1945 from the military, as many people were. That's when he secured the position with the owner about that time with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So now they're married.
Was he an officer, by the way?
He was offered an officer but declined. He was an NCO. I never knew all the reasons. I think it was part of that. He didn't want to. He just low key. He didn't want to. But that's just hearsay to me. I do know that he went to Okinawa at one point in the military.
Did he ever talk with you about his military experiences?
He talked a little bit about it. I mean, not from the horror standpoint, but just from the way things were at the time. He talked about trying to get home to see Mother and me and the troop trains and how crowded it was and just how things were just totally, in flux at the time. But the good news for him was he survived and came home. The first I remember about him and her and us was 1947, when my sister was born, when they came to Dublin to find a place to live because his job was in that area. And they talked about how towns like Dublin were unprepared, didn't have housing. I mean, it was just a huge, the war effort was one thing, but then people were coming back trying to get situated, and they were able to find a place, an upstairs of a house, and then of course subsequently bought their own home and stayed. But Mother, at some point, I think in the early years when my sister and I were growing up, from about 47, 48 till about 1953, I think she was home with us. We were sent to private kindergarten. There wasn't any public kindergarten at the time. But we had the good fortune to get into a good kindergarten program there in the town of Dublin. And then she went back to work, and she was employed at the local high school, Dublin High School, as a teacher, and spent 4 years teaching school.
What subject did she teach?
And she taught English and Latin. Taught English and Latin, for which she had trained.
So did
and I have found as executor of the estate, I've found some old textbooks, you know.
So did she transfer any particular types of, I would say, books that she really enjoyed? Did she transfer that love to you?
Well, she read to us all the classics, the children's literature. She emphasized the need to study the classics and to be a good reader. Mm-hmm. Yeah, can't remember any particular text that she promoted, but I just remember my mother, like her father, had a real people connection. She knew everybody, and she was friendly, and she was beloved by her students. I saw some of the notes in the yearbooks. She just regrettably passed too soon. She succumbed to a kidney disease called nephritis, which is known as Bright's disease. Way back, she, as a child, had diphtheria, and it is thought that led to her with a weakness, and she got sick, and she had this disease, and that was pre-dialysis days. There wasn't much they could do with the morbidity with that condition. But God, for her short life, I think she made some real positive contributions, and I think hopefully my sister and I inherited her wish to be communicative, to be able to be a communicative person, and also to do good for other people, best you could, to help.
So you indicated that your mother did a lot of community service. What kinds of things?
Well, community and church service. She did a lot of church, Sunday school teacher. She worked with the local equivalent of the United Way. It would be the clothing closet. Didn't have that many back then, but she was a community effort to help people who were more in need than we were. And we weren't in need, actually.
And did you accompany her with any of her?
I don't remember doing that. Again, I was probably 9 or 10 at the time. But I do remember a lot about the church involvement, because we were required to go to church and Sunday school, and I was reared Presbyterian, so we had to learn the catechism and all of those sort of things. And in a small town like Dublin, the church is a real center of activity. And that's where you knew your friends and your cohorts.
And so who were some of your friends during those early years?
My best friend is a gentleman named Edward Gordon Simpson, and he and I were like joined at the hip. And when my mother got ill, my parents were good friends with his parents, played bridge and did things together. And when Daddy was struggling with my mother in the hospital, we spent a lot of time with the Simpsons. My sister and I, he had one sister, Carolyn, who was a little bit older but was linked up with Nancy, my sister. But we spent a lot of nights there because Dad would be away at the hospital, and they were just kind of taking care of us like second parents. But we have just had a friendship that has survived forever. He has gone on in an education career. He ended up getting his doctorate at Tech, where he attended all, and he spent some time with the Southern Association of Colleges, and he ended up in Athens, Georgia, at the University of Georgia, and Institute of Government, and more recently he retired from that and went over to the American University in Cairo before things turned really bleak there. But he is in Georgia, and we communicate, and he's, like me, has become a recent grandfather, so he's real excited.
And
that was my best friend. I had other friends from high school. And again, in a small town like I was from, in a local public high school, you tended to have a lot of friends, and acquaintances.
were there any teachers or other adults who really affected the way that you see things?
I would say that in Hargrave, when I went there, the last 3 years, 10, 11, and 12, I had 2 or 3 professors or teachers that I really thought well of. One of them was Colonel Cullen Brooks, who taught, he was a multi-faceted guy. He taught geometry. He was a math teacher. I didn't like geometry, but he taught algebra. And he taught Latin. He did it, so I got him for 2 or 3 ways. Colonel Charles Pace was the ultimate English teacher, old VMI guy.
Why do you say ultimate English?
Because he was the old school English teacher, when grammar was so the thing. The wrong to, the wrong there, the wrong split infinitive, the dangling participle, you failed your theme. You folded your paper wrong is 10 points off. I mean, he wasn't a guy that put you in fear, but there were rules and you followed the rules. And I give him a lot of credit. I mean, when I went to University of Richmond, I wasn't particularly well versed in literature, which I should have been. I mean, I knew enough about certain things, but I could write a theme grammatically correctly. So, the old bleeding red pen, I don't think universities and colleges teach grammar like they used to, but because spell check has come in.
Don't worry, I still bleed over all of my student papers.
Good for you. I mean, I'm not trying to be a martyr to it, but I do enough substitute teaching that, I'm just appalled by some of the grammar. I was doing a homebound session with a young man who was a smart young man about 2 years ago. And first he had to have the PowerPoint, so we had to get that communicated. And then one day he said the spell check was down, and I said, X, have you heard about dictionaries and thesauruses? Yes. I said, we're going to finish this theme, and you're going to find one somewhere. We're going to finish this theme. And I said, yeah, you can't rely on spell check.
There is a technology dependency.
Yeah. Well, the real problem with spell check is you can get all that right, but you can have the wrong homonym. You can still mess up.
Malapropisms are a problem.
But Colonel Pace and Colonel Brooks, we had to take religion. It was a Baptist school, and we had to take a religion course. Captain Griffin was an interesting fella. So being in a small school, being with a small number of people, I got a lot of individual attention. Maybe the group I was competing with wasn't that excited about being valedictorian, but it was a great honor to have achieved that ranking.
Did you keep in touch with any of the professors?
I did for a while, because at one point I was put on the alumni board down there, and of course now, this was 1962, they're all gone at this point. Mm-hmm. But through about the 80s, I was able to stay in touch with them.
And while you were there, did you have any idea or inclination as to what college you were going to? Was it expected? Let me ask you that. Was it expected that you would go to college?
Yes.
And then after that, did you already know or have an idea where you wanted to go?
Yeah, college was always the goal, and yes, it was expected. Initially, I was going to Hampton-Sydney.
Why?
Because I grew up Presbyterian, and it was a very strong school. It was a strong liberal arts school. It had a good pre-med and pre-law curriculum. And I had a lot of friends who went there. Southwest Virginia particularly, which is Presbyterian oriented, and my minister at the time was a Hampton-Sydney graduate. Because just like the Methodist schools, they also prepared ministers. But there was one fallacy in that argument. My dad, I guess University of Virginia was really something on my radar scope, but my dad weighed in heavily on that. You're too young, but UVA, despite its good academic rating, was considered the sin city of the world at the time. It was the big, I think my dad, in trying to protect me, thought I would just be swallowed up and destroyed at UVA, so he encouraged me not to apply. I applied at University of Richmond because my uncle, Dr. Matthews, and my Aunt Mary, who'd gone to West Hampton, which is part of University, they called me, and my uncle was very prominent. They both were very prominent in U of R politics. My uncle was president of the Alumni Association the year I was going, and he said, would you consider University of Richmond? Because it would honor us if you would go there, because I have 3 cousins. Nobody, and our kids are going. One first cousin is a doctor. He went to Duke. The other one, my lady cousin, went to Averett and Radford, and then the third one went to Washington Lee. And I said, sure. And it turns out Hargrave being Baptist is linked to U of R, because most of my professors at Hargrave were U of R people, including the president, Joseph Cosby at the time, from Newport News. And he was a retired Baptist minister, now president of Hargrave. And so I applied there. I applied at King College, which was Presbyterian, Hampton City. I think I applied at, I'm not sure about William and Mary, but anyway, I was given acceptance wherever I applied, and didn't apply at UVA, but I was also given some scholarship to U of R. Not much, but some enough to make it important. And at the time, U of R, being private, was more expensive than, say, UVA. And so it was a good, and my dad had saved for me and my sister, but it was going to be help to have some scholarship aid. So picked the University of Richmond. And in retrospect, it probably was the right choice, because I grew up in a small town. Hampton Sydney's in the middle of a cow field, in the middle of the country. And so it was probably time for me to get to the city. And U of R offered that opportunity, although it's not in the city, it's close enough. Mm-hmm. So it kind of was, let's open the world to a bigger picture.
So what was that experience like for you?
Well, having gone away at 15, I was a little bit ahead of my entering freshman, because I'd been away and had to kind of learn to tend to myself, and being in an environment of military structure, I knew how to organize. And Hargrave sold its program on because a lot of people were there for academic help. I was not there for academic help, but the how to study program, to get these people percolating on academics. So at U of R, I was not as wide-eyed to the new experience as probably some of the other people that were coming there at the time. I was a little more, quote, grown up at the time, I think. Mm-hmm. So the experience at Richmond was good. Richmond is and has always been a good school, strong academically. It was a little probably homogeneous, as most of the schools were at the time. Mm-hmm. I didn't have the good fortune to meet African Americans or Asian Americans. I understand Oriental's not the word we use. Asian Americans or mm-hmm. people from other situations, backgrounds. But it was a good introduction to me to the big world and to the big picture. I again started out like all freshmen, taking the basic stuff, and then I got into the degree program I wanted to be in, and got involved with student government and some other things going on, fraternity.
Mm-hmm. And so were there any professors there or even classmates who really impacted your life during that period?
Ultimately, I think the professor that I most remember is, and you've heard it, it was in another interview I read, was a political science professor, Spencer Albright. He's now deceased. He was about 5'3" tall, just one of those people that you wanted to listen to because he had such knowledge of so many areas, and he was I guess a constitutional expert. I really fell in love in political science with constitutional law. And that was one of my favorite subjects. And also at University of Virginia, that was my favorite subject.
What was it about constitutional law that
I
was so
think it
interesting?
is just how it has molded the law based on the Constitution, and case law to, everything from equal protection to voting rights. You can see the skeleton and you can see the flesh being built around it. And the precedent of the Brown v. Board, a lot of the most telling cases that come back. Turns out that there was a professor at UVA that had gone to the University of Richmond, and Dick Howard, A.E. Dick Howard, his name. I understand he's being brought in, I saw it in the paper the other day, he helped rewrite the Constitution of Virginia last time it was revised, and he's being brought in now to talk about how we can break this budget impasse based on some readings of the Virginia Constitution. But Spencer Albright, I had Dr. Boggs in English was a good guy. I had other professors but Ralph McDaniel, history professor. They used to say, Ralph McDaniel, you get a conservative amount of liberalism, and with Albright with Albright you get a liberal amount of conservatism, and vice versa with the other.
So you had a balance.
I had a balance, yeah. And it was a small department, only 2 to 3 people, and the classes were small, so you get to know people. You mentioned any students. There were many. One that comes to mind is Rob Baldwin, who I knew a little bit at the time, but I could see he was a rising star, and we had some communication at that time.
Were you all in the same class?
He was 1 year behind.
Okay.
I finished in '66 and he finished in '67. There were 2 or 3 folks that ended up being judges that I knew. A Norfolk fellow who was a friend, Charlie Poston from Norfolk, was a friend at U of R and later became a judge. You also knew him, and I didn't say earlier, but I got out and spent 21 years in the Army Reserve, and I retired. And Charlie was also in the Army Reserve. I'd see him in that context. I met another judge who's from Norfolk, but I met him at UVA, Lester Moore. He was a juvenile judge. He's a classmate of mine.
So you had a very good exposure to people who would become important.
Yes.
In your career.
Yes.
And you saw the promise of a lot of these individuals.
I did.
Do you think you were impacted at all in those early years by your association with them, or would that come later?
I think I was impacted by the experience of knowing people who, in my view, would be important later. I didn't know, I didn't have a crystal ball, but there were certain people, there are always certain people that sort of stand out, and you wonder, it's like my 45th reunion law school, what happened to those people in those years? What's going on in their lives? Probably it was just happenstance that I ended up in this career, which ended up intersecting with these people. And I think our previous knowing each other helped communication. I wasn't, in any sense, even though I was the administrator person at this point, I wasn't trying to dictate them orders. It was just the idea that we had a communication link that was facilitated by our knowing each other.
Now, you indicated that you went to UVA Law School.
Yes.
Now, this is, of course, contrary to what your
father
wanted.
My dad, when I was thinking about law school, and I had the opportunity, I had 3 admissions to law school at the time.
What were those 3?
University of Richmond, which I think they thought I was going to go to, Wake Forest, and University of Virginia. UVA, even then, was difficult to get into. And all of them were difficult to get into. It was the war years, and so people were trying to get into a school, and I had the commission, so I had a deferral. But when I got in UVA, my dad was like, happiest person in the world because he knew how good it was. And so his opinion, law school was fine. It was just that decadent university college that I wasn't supposed to go to. And at the time you took orders from your parents. If I'd wanted to go to UVA, I could have gone, but since he was writing the checks, I sort of had to go where he said, and U of R was okay. It was very acceptable, but UVA would just be the path to hell, And so, but in law school, that was a different story. It was a wonderful opportunity, and I felt very privileged to get into UVA. I had a strong academic, I was fortunate in Richmond to make several attainments. I Phi Beta Kappa and Omicron Delta Kappa, and of course the fraternity. I was probably not the strongest on paper person to go to UVA, but there were others like me. Not everybody can go to Yale and Harvard and all that, but it was good enough to get in, and I really feel like Dr. Albright may have been my key to the door, because I applied, and he wrote a personal letter to Dick Howard, his student, who was during his time, he was a Rhodes Scholar. But anyway, on Spencer Albright's, my application was bolstered by Spencer Albright's referral letter, I'm sure. But I got in, and I survived, and I passed. As many people would say, I'm one of those people who made the upper half possible. But law school in those days was really tough. The gentleman's C was the norm. Nobody got A's. No weighted anything. It was, But the good news is, whereas at Richmond, which I got in, they started with 75 and ended up with 50. At UVA, the point is, if you got in, you usually stayed, because there would be some sort of admission that their admissions policy had missed putting you in there. But I did pass, and I did come out okay at the end. But again, I feel real privileged to have gotten to go to UVA, because it's still a very strong school.
Were there any law professors who impacted the way that you saw the law and interpreted it?
I think there's some that come to mind. Not sure that I was buddy with them, but there was one professor of Virginia Law and Procedure. He was a blind professor. His name was T. Munford Boyd. He was a memory guy because he's blind. And he helped rewrite the Virginia Code, but he would lecture. And he was a funny guy, too. He told us one time that his most embarrassing time in life was when he went to give a speech one time and some damn fool said on his notes, the Braille notes. And there was a famous institution at UVA called the Libel Show. It's where the students play the professors in a spoof, and I got to play him. And he let me wear one of his favorite ties, and I only had one line. My role was a sentry on an outpost, and the phrase was, "Who goes there?" And my answer was, "Who goes where?" And but he was one that stuck. Charles Gregory, who taught torts, a very wizened Yankee, if you will, who took no prisoners, but he was just such a subject matter expert. So much in law school being the Socratic method, you just had to be, as you said, drilled down. You had to be grilled down if you got called on. Mm-hmm. And they had the infamous seating charts. And back in those days, both in college and law school, the modern folks don't know Saturday classes. We had to go to Saturday classes. You're much too young to know that.
Thank you for saying that.
I don't think you went to Saturday classes.
No, I did not. So your experience at UVA.
That was the real growing up time.
Why do you say that?
because unlike Richmond and most of the traditional places where you learn subject matter, and a lot of it is still regurgitating back or maybe writing back from sources, UVA is the first time that I was challenged truly intellectually, because I had a peer group that was very competitive, and I lived in fear of not being able to measure up. And also, I was, for the first time, dealing with multi-ethnicities, people from, it was the beginning of women in law, and it was amazing to see the women there. They were brilliant, but they had to be, I could sense their fear in not measuring up. And I met my first true African-American friends in a collegial situation at that point. Lester Moore being one of them. Mm-hmm. We lived in the same suite, and then so many of the students were from the Ivy League, and I really, just knowing them and listening to them, I just got such a broader vision of the world in academics and what was out there to be conquered or challenged.
So what kinds of assumptions that you had growing up that were really challenged at that point?
I think the assumptions that were challenged was that in academia, if you just worked hard, you would always succeed. And in law school, there was no doubt about working hard, but it didn't always end up putting you at the top of the class. It was more of a survival mode, competitive survival. Mm-hmm. And also, I began to sense the world is not a kind place out there. It's, there's, as my wife says, you're not with cotton bunting. You are there, and you got to get that door open. And when you go out there, you're going to be dealing with sharks, people that are not always going to be kind and gentle. Not to say the world is made up totally of that, but I didn't have, being from a provincial situation, I didn't have a good view of how the real world worked at that point. Now, if I had stayed in the context of Virginia and practicing law, I probably would have had a bit better concept of that if I'd gone to U of R or William and Mary or one of the state law schools that was gearing its people. But I was on the platform of people who were heading to Wall Street or heading to San Francisco or to Atlanta. And at that point I began to think, I'm not going to be able to make this, or this is not what I want to do. This is really not where I want to be headed.
Were you aware at the time of all of the different societal transitions that were taking place?
Good question, because the years 66 to 69 were very pivotal years. And 68 particularly was a rough year. I was at UVA when both Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were assassinated. It was just a horrible time. The war was going on. People in the law school were like everywhere else. They were trying to get into some kind of reserve. It was the draft. People were being pulled out. I had the luxury of being able to be deferred, but people were spending every other waking hour than studying just trying to get into a reserve unit to defer as long as they could.
How were you able to get it deferred?
Because as a ROTC commissioned officer, they allowed you to go onto a graduate school before they called you in for your required service.
Mm-hmm. And so what, you had indicated that you were suite mates with Lester Moore and others, and so what kinds of conversations did you all have?
We talked mostly about subject matter, courses we were both involved. We had study groups together, but in our one entertainment of the day was going out to dinner somewhere or going to a football game on the weekend. Just learning to know each other and to know their backgrounds and where they were coming from. I believe my memory is that Lester had gone to that school in Durham, North Carolina something.
North Carolina
AT&T?
Central.
Central, yeah, he'd gone to Central. But I used to laugh at Lester. Lester was from a very well-to-do family in Norfolk. Mm-hmm. And I used to joke, I said, he would sort of start talking about civil rights issues or needs of people. I said, how would you know, Lester? You've never had any need, because he was an only child. He had two maiden aunts, I'm sure from who doted on him, and he would get huffy about that, but it was all in good fun, But I learned from Lester about a different family that I didn't know. Southwest Virginia, where I grew up, had a very low percentage of African Americans, 10%. When they started the integration of schools in Virginia in 1965, they started out there because they could work their way over. My sister actually went to our high school with the first African American student from the area. Integration went pretty smoothly out there. Not the problems they had as you went east. But for me, having gone to a private military school that had no students of color, we did have, I can't say we didn't have different people because there were lots of Hispanic people there from Mexico and from Puerto Rico and Central America. So I met some people at Hargrave that expanded my vision at that point. But U of R, none, and UVA, a small number. But I ended up being friends with two or three. In fact, Bob Williams, who is my UVA law class, he went back home. He's a practicing attorney in Martinsville, and I had a long conversation with him at our reunion.
Did you have any ideas as to what you wanted to do when you were perhaps going into your third year of law school?
Well, and you had the military academy. I thought, first I had to get the bar, but I thought I would probably, I didn't really have a stomach for big city practice. I thought, well, maybe I'll end up back in a small town being a country lawyer. Or maybe I'll do something in banking because I liked banking also. But I'll worry about that when I get back. Well, when I got back, I ended up going into the banking and kind of preparing for the bar exam. And then what will I do after that? Wasn't quite sure. But I didn't have a fire in the belly to do one thing or the other at that point. I also thought, well, maybe I could teach. But again, I didn't end up doing that at all at the beginning. I felt like I would end up, okay. I just wasn't sure where that was going to be at the time. The circumstance that caused me to be here was just a chance thing. I was able to get ultimately where probably I was most comfortable, and that was in the court system, Virginia. I had no idea that that would ever be something I would be doing. Didn't even know what it was about at the time.
So before we get into that, I want to ask you a little bit about your personal life.
Okay.
So what was happening at that point? When did you get married? How did you meet your wife?
Okay. I got married July 12th, 1975. I married a wonderful woman, my wife of 39 years. Her name is, this is a Georgia name, so her name is Wylan Quillian Letson now Hodnett. She goes by Lynn, L-Y-N, the Lynn, the Lynn. My wife was born in Atlanta, Georgia. Her father, whom she never knew, was killed in D-Day +3 and is buried at Normandy. Her mother and father grew up in a place which is now part of Atlanta called Norcross, Georgia, just north of the big city. And her dad, at age 33, joined the Navy in World War II and must have, Lynn was born February of '45. So I think before he departed, she was initiated May of '44 and went over and was regrettably killed. He was a Navy guy, but right there, Omaha Beach, a water concussion bomb went off, and I never saw him, and she never saw him again. He was buried there. But her mother, now widow, came to Virginia. Her mother was one of 5 sisters, and one of her other sisters was in Virginia, married to Mr. Stuart Blanton, who was in the Army at the time, and they were getting ready to have their first child, and the sister's name was Callie Blanton. And so Pat Blanton, Sarah Frances, Pat they called her, came with young Lynn, age 2, to be with her sister Callie, who was getting ready to have a baby. And in the process, her stepfather, who was another Blanton, Weldon Clay Blanton, met, fell in love with, and married my mother-in-law, Pat. And so Lynn was raised in Ashland, where they were from, Ashland, Virginia, where we now live. And from 2 till her current time, grew up in Virginia. She was born in Georgia, grew up in Virginia. She is a graduate of Mayor Baldwin College, and her career was spent as a school teacher for the years before and shortly after we were married. How do we meet? We met, I was home from Vietnam. I was working at the bank. She was rooming with a cousin of mine, one of the Sarah. And so it was just one of those, my cousin's home, he's from the military, I want you to meet him. And so we met, and we met as a singles group over this, it was infamous at the time, it was a place called St. John's Woods, where all the single people lived. And we met in a tennis group in 1974. And actually I had dated some other of her friends before I met Lynn. So we met and were married in '75, and fortunately are still married. We were lucky to spend a few years by ourselves, and then we were fortunate to have children. We brought into this world our first son in 1980, January 17th. His name is Andrew Quillian Hodnett, and he is a namesake of his father. Well, Andrew's from my name, but Quillian is from his grandfather, the one who's buried at Normandy. It's real interesting. My wife took him at age 14 to the 50th celebration of the D-Day, and in 1994, and he got picked up just by happenstance on the Today Show at the ceremony. He was fortunately dressed with a coat and tie, and it was raining that day, but some people back in Ashland were watching and he just got on the screen, and they were able to save the tape for us. So that's sort of interesting. And then his brother, Samuel Anderson, was born in 1982. So we have 2 sons. My older son, Andrew, is married and to a wonderful woman, and they got married in 2008, and they have 2 granddaughters by that marriage. And Lynn, back to Lynn, she was teaching she taught both public and private. Before I knew her, she taught at Virginia Beach during the war years after college, and then she came to Richmond and taught in the public schools of Richmond. And then she went to work for a private school in Richmond called Collegiate. And she was in the lower school, and that's when I met her. And she worked, after we were married in 75, through, I think, 1980 at Collegiate, or 1979. And then we were fortunate to have children, and from that point on, she was able, thank goodness, to stay home and be a stay-home mom and grandmom now. She's traveled to Normandy twice. She and I like traveling, and she's really, talking about civics, she's really involved with civic issues, and she's a big garden clubber, and she's a big church worker, and she is now involved with some political things and does a lot with that.
So you married someone in a way like your mother.
I think so, and people say that she, from pictures of my mother, she looks like my mother.
That's usually how it is.
That's what I hear.
Now, before you were hired in some ways in the court system, you were working as a translator in Vietnam, or at least in intelligence.
Yeah.
And I want you to talk a little bit about that experience, because a number of people were terrified of going over to Vietnam.
That's a good question, because it takes me back a little bit to my Army schooling. Those years were pretty bad. I mean, the national fabric was just being torn, and the protests were beginning to happen. And I had no conscience at the time to be rebellious against the cause, because I was in the traditional lockstep of, okay, I've signed on, this is my duty, I must do it. So there was never any question that I would follow the steps to wherever they sent me. The first school I went to, combat intelligence, which had initially been plainclothes, behind the scenes, all of a sudden the Vietnam War transitioned the branch into combat orientation, where you were dealing in a combat role. So they sent us all to a combat school, without getting into too much detail about. One of the combat schools is infantry, and then you have armor, and then you have artillery, blah, blah, blah. But at the time I was coming in, the infantry school, which is the normal entry point, was filled up. So they diverted my class to armor, which is at Fort Knox. You're still learning a combat branch. But that was the first time I heard sort of protest. Most of the people in intelligence assignments were more educated in the sense of formal education, and a lot of them were lawyers. I'll never forget this sergeant lecturing us on something to do about the tank one day, and one of the guys who I'll give you a little follow-up on this guy, he was a lawyer, and we just happened to be thrown together, and he was from New Jersey or New York. We weren't paying attention, or he wasn't paying attention, and the sergeant asked him a question. He says, I'll mimic his accent, "Sergeant, you're doing a great job, but frankly, we don't give a damn." So this same guy went to the next school, which was at Fort Holabird, Maryland. That's where you got your branch training. Well, our class was called QV-18, I'll never forget it. And I asked one day, what does QV stand for? And that was Quick Vietnam. So Dave Glasser he ended up being the only person I ever knew at the time, but one of the first people who actually was a test case. He got out on conscientious objection.
Really?
And that was a big thing. What's all this about? You're a military guy now, you're supposed to take an order. But he just couldn't take it anymore. And then after that was they trained us for some language training. They said I passed. I guessed everybody. I don't know if everybody passed or not. But then they sent you to a language training area, which was way out in West Texas at El Paso. Fort Bliss, it was called. And we were all out there for a crash course, 3 months in Vietnamese language training. Vietnamese is a difficult language. The premier, the creme de creme, were sent to Monterey to the Language Institute, but they didn't have time to send us through the year-long course because they needed to get people over there. And I learned the Me Tarzan You Jane version. I can still speak a little Vietnamese. I can say some basic stuff. But at that point, the only thing I feared was where will they send me over there? Because you were told by the people who've been there, the one assignment you do not want is I-Corps, which is in the north, next to the DMZ. Of course, where do I go? I go to Saigon, which is the central processing, and I get sent to I-Corps. But nothing I can do about it. So the central city of I-Corps is Da Nang in the north. That's where it all started. It's about 2 provinces below the DMZ. And the good news for me was I got there the first one and was able to meet with the personnel officer and lobbied for this job, which was in Da Nang, versus being sent out to the bush. And fortunately, I got the assignment. Now, that's not to say there wasn't danger. There was lots of danger. We were headquartered in Da Nang. My operational center was out on the outskirts of town. But because Da Nang was such a central place, we were under constant attack from rocket fire. And also, I was in the language part of it. My job was to glean order of battle intelligence from prisoners of war who had been captured, either North Vietnamese NVA or the rebel forces. And at that point in 60 and 70, the NVA troops had pretty well been depleted at that point. But we were still getting some fairly credible sources. And they were housed in a prisoner of war camp, which is next to our place. But every day I had to drive the route, and there were always the unknowns about bombs in the road, or people in the crowd shooting at you. There's not much you could do. It was at night we had to stay inside. We couldn't. The city was dangerous to walk. So I didn't fear the assignment, but I did fear the circumstances. It was just an uncertainty for the year.
Were you involved in actual interrogation?
Yes, every day. But the good news was we were assigned regular translators, natives who were assigned. I was in the role of what they call MACV. I was there as an advisor. I was not assigned to U.S. troops. We were advisors. And our mission was to develop the intelligence stream, and we had to report to a center. There were what they call CICs, Central Interrogation Centers, in all 4 of the provinces. The Vietnamese had 4 provinces. And we had to report our intelligence across secure lines to Saigon. At the time, now it's called Ho Chi Minh City. But we were able to also send particularly important prisoners of war down there for more interrogation. We were there to develop intelligence on, at the time, our downed pilots above the DMZ. We're trying to find out from sources that we were interrogating what's going on with our people. We never made entry into across the DMZ. But we were the closest to the action there was. I was also there with the Marines because the Marines were the first in country, and the Army came in to relieve them. But for the almost full year I was there, I was co-located in this interrogation center, and I have a lot of good Marine friends. I would never be one. I could never aspire to that, but they didn't like they were there for the second tour, and they were artillery folks out in the thick of it the first time. This time they'd been recycled to interrogators after going through the school, but they were always looking for action. But every time they'd say, we can go out on a convoy, you want to go with us today? And I said, not so much paperwork, I don't see myself getting out of here ever.
How did that experience change your thinking or?
Well, in the background tapestry of the war, which we were pretty much in the thick of, we were just trying to do our job, trying to understand the geopolitical goings on, knowing that there was a lot of ranting going on back home. But again, we were still under the command of the military and the president, to whom we answered. So we didn't think about that as much, but as just getting our day job over and getting home, hopefully, in one piece. But being there, you knew all the things that were going on, and the order of battle would tell you where we were, how we were doing in relation to the war effort. At that point, we were in the process of what they call Vietnamization. Our role was to train our counterparts and to turn over the direction of what was going on to them, and that was pretty much in process. I could tell, even at that point, that things were not going that well for the South Vietnamese. It was, if you go back in history, the Vietnamese War is sort of a North-South civil war in that country. You had tribes of different, their language is slightly different, but the North was the industrial part, Ho Chi Minh's area. The South was the breadbasket. The fight was to get South and to get the food and to reclaim the land. And I could just never sense the people I dealt with, who were good people, all of them good people. And that's another learning experience. I learned another culture. I learned about their families. I learned about what's going on in their minds. I'll never forget, I worked with a colonel one time, a very fine gentleman, and he says, in Vietnam, we raised large families because under the Asian tradition, Oriental tradition, it's sort of like Social Security, the family must take care of each other. So we have lots of children. So when I get old, they'll take care of me. But I never sensed, it was hot as Hades over there, but at 2 o'clock they would close the tent and take their siesta, middle of the day thing, and the war's still going on. I left in 71, they fell in 75. So the point of all this is I don't think the Vietnamization ever worked. I think, I don't want to get too political, but I think the politicos, the political leaders back here were not getting the full story. I don't think the truth was being told. When I came back in 71, I was like a lot of returning military. I sensed that nobody appreciated really what we did. We were a little bit distasteful to a lot of people. So get off and get on with your life. I mean, there wasn't anybody, not that I expected any ticker tape, but there was a real bad taste in a lot of people's mouths about the whole thing at that point. It was in 72, after I came home in October 71, when Nixon, the president, began to de-escalate things. That's another point. Back in Fort Holabird, we knew we had to go over, so they came in with a special offer. If you'll do one more year, we'll send you to Hawaii or somewhere exotic, but we can't promise that you won't go. But it turned out the people who took what they called that option, they ended up not having to go at all because it was over. But, you know, it's like gambling, you know. I said, no, I'm not going to give them another year.
Was it very disorienting for you when you returned?
No, I think I melded back into the society. I mean, I had to find a job, and nobody was picketing my house or anything. I think I just sort of tried to reassume a normal civilian role quick as I could. I did, as I said, end up staying in the military. I did like the military. The war didn't discourage me from just getting out, so I ended up getting in a reserve situation and staying for a number of years.
What did you like about the military?
Well, I think it has structure, it has pride, it has the opportunities to do your craft and to deal with people. I think it, and I still think it has an honorable position in our society.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had mentioned that you were working for the bank, but then you had lunch with Hugh Bennett?
Judge Bennett, yes.
Now, tell me about how you met him and how this lunch came about.
I had known Judge Bennett because of the family connection in Chatham, and he was good friends of that doctor uncle and my Aunt Mary who grew up with him. And Chatham must be a place of longevity because Hubert was 103 when he passed. Something about the water, I guess. But there was a place up here, it's now part of VCU, called the Chesterfield Tea Room. I don't know if anybody here knows what it is. But anyway, it was one of those old places you don't find anymore with home cooking, and a lot of people went there for dinner, and it was actually a dinner meal. And when I first came back to Richmond, I rented space, boarded with an older gentleman who was a widower who was a friend of my uncle and aunts. And so he liked to go to dinner, and you know, I was single at the time, and would sometimes accompany him to the Chesterfield for dinner. And the Bennetts were regulars. They never had children, and they lived in a place where they could cook, but they took a lot of their meals out. So just one evening, we all ended up at the Chesterfield for dinner. So I just, as I would, got up from my seat and went over to speak to him. And that's when he started telling me about, you know, he always say, "How are things going, Mr. Bennett?" He said, "Oh, woe is me. You can't believe what they're making me do. They're reorganizing the courts. I've got all this stuff to do. I'm just getting worn out with it, blah, blah, blah." He had been appointed executive secretary in 1952. And he was a judge at the time of the old trial court. And he was brought to Richmond to the then Supreme Court to be somebody who would administer the circuit courts and to be staff to the Supreme Court and to come up with some training. And so his efforts from 52 to 2000, from 52 to 73 was pretty much a low-key operation. He operated out of the Supreme Court, which was initially, when I was hired, up on Broad Street. You entered the Supreme Court of Virginia in that building. It's now called the Patrick Henry Building. But that was Supreme Court on the Broad Street entrance, State Library on the Capitol. That's now been closed and reworked, and is the Patrick Henry Building. But that night, he just said all the things that were being thrown at him, and I'm going to be needing some help. And I said something innocuous like, "Well, that sounds interesting. Keep me in mind if I can be of any help." And went back and had dinner. And darn if he didn't call me the next day and said, "Are you serious? I'd love to talk to you about a possibility up here." And I said, "Sure." So I went up to that lunchtime appointment. and the rest is history, as they say. You know.
So tell me a little bit about him, about his personality and his
Hubert Bennett was,
interaction.
first and all, was a true gentleman. He was of the old school. He was from Chatham. His father was a doctor, country doctor in Chatham. He grew up right there on Main Street, attended Hargrave himself, and went on to law school. I think he may have done UVA at the time, and ended up going back to Chatham and becoming, he did a little bit of practice, but he was appointed a judge at the time and served in that district. And for some reason, he and another gentleman who was the longtime clerk of the Supreme Court, a fellow named Howard Turner, were hired in 1952 to sort of as staff to the Supreme Court. I have no real feel for the politics of the time, but he served ably from 52 to 73 in that smaller context. He is, from my memory of him and from reports I've got, he was a low-key, very traditional guy, but had a real good manner with being able to get things done for the Supreme Court, to develop statistics that they wanted to know about caseload and things like that. Did some training, but never was put in the role until 73, where he was perceived by some to be now becoming the big super effecto guy who's going to be controlling our destiny. And this is nothing he had anything to do with the legislature. There was a precedent study called the Ianson Commission study. Ianson was the second Chief Justice I worked for. He was from Portsmouth, Lawrence W. Ianson. But he just happened to be the chair of this committee that led to the Court Reorganization Act. What was happening in Virginia at the time was, in that period of 15 to 73, Virginia was changing. It was moving from basically agrarian to more of a suburban situation. Population was increasing. With population comes court statistics, crime. There was the need, and the study recognized that we had a system of what we call part-time judges at the district level, and that's where all the work is. They practiced law half day and they did judging half day. So the effect of the Court Reorganization Act was to force the states at the local level to hand off courts to the state level, I mean from the local to the state, and then to require the judges to become full-time. Had to give up that salary. They could elect. They weren't forced to do anything. But if you were going to be a commissioned judge, you had to be, that's your full-time day job. And judges in Virginia are a little different than other states, because in most states judges are popularly elected, just like other constitutional officers, but in Virginia they're appointed by the legislature. So all of a sudden we've got the aura, or you've got the prospect of now bringing under one centralized office the totality of the system, to include all levels of court, Supreme, Circuit at the time, and now the new General District Court system, split between General District and Juvenile and Domestic Relations. So now we're going from a very small focus to having the administrative office be the smorgasbord of all the activities that are now the new court system. That ranges from HR, IT, finance, fiscal, education, training, all of those things that run the business of courts. And so all of a sudden we're dealing with all of that with about 2,500 people to administer. And you have nothing, you have no baseline to go on. So and Mr. Bennett's facing with this. So we're now beginning July 1 of 73, and that's not an important date just because I began to work there, but that was sort of the kicking off date of the system. So the Court Reorganization Act created what is known as a Committee on District Courts, which is made up of legislators and judges. And honest to goodness, I can say this because I was the first one on board. It was sort of you work all week and you go off on the weekend and you plan next week. It was just literally day to day and week to week just to keep it together. Not to say that you didn't have to then start developing systems. Well, Mr. Bennett was about to wear out, and I was doing the best I could with some other staff people just to keep things together, learning as we went. But the Supreme Court decided Bennett's now announced his retirement, we need to get a replacement. Well, unfortunately for me, I passed the bar in 73 when I came to work there. You had to have the qualifications of a circuit judge under their definition to be the executive secretary. You have the same qualifications, and you had to have 5 years at the bar. Well, I didn't have it. So they hired the best man, and I literally say they did hire a wonderful person, and the best man, they hired Robert Baldwin, who at the time, and you've got his history, you know what he went through, but he was a professor of law at T.C. Williams, University of Richmond Law School, and he became the executive secretary in 76. My first title was deputy executive secretary to the executive secretary, but then when he became the executive secretary, they changed my title to assistant executive secretary. But I didn't get quite the bells and whistles he got with his position. I was just a simple VRS person with 1 year credit for 1 year service. Rob was given the weighted service of the judicial retirement system, which was good. Back then, to get people into the system, they gave you 3.5 years of service for 1 year, credit for 1 year of service. And that's not out of spite or envy, but that was just his good fortune. Mm-hmm. Because at the time, the theory was that you would get to be a judge when you're 50s and spend 14, 15 years, and you would max out because you only create 50 years in the system. It's a different system. And then you'd retire. But what started happening was the 30s and 40-year-old people started raising their hands and getting judgeships. They didn't get any more than 50 years, but they had to work for just salary. But anyway, that's a whole different story.
Let me go back for a minute. You made a comment about how at the point at which the courts were really being, or the whole structure was being reassessed and reconfigured,
Right.
that Judge Bennett really was low-key.
Yeah.
And essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, was there a sense from him that this was a bit overwhelming or beyond what he felt comfortable doing?
Yes, very much so. And it's sort of a joke because the people who knew him and who were his early staff, his key word, it's Mr. H, it's hopeless. Mr. H, it's hopeless. It wasn't hopeless, but to him it was becoming hopeless. Yeah, he was at that point in his 70s. He understood the concept, but he also, I think, just wasn't up to the challenge. It was a sort of a sport for a younger guy, not an older guy. And he was in the twilight of his career.
So between the time that he retired and they brought in Baldwin, what were some of the things that you had to do? Because that process had to at least move forward.
What we had to do was, at that point, we really hadn't integrated all the people that were coming into the system. I mean, we were just trickling people in at that point. We had to provide payrolls. We had to provide, there wasn't any real IT support at that point. we had to provide paperwork. What I did was, one of the main things that Bennett did, and which I assumed, was what they call the designation of judges. This is special assignment for judges because the local judge is disqualified in a case, or to send in help of one judge to another help. I actually had to handle the coordination of and the issuance of the orders of appointment, called designation orders. And that was a pretty busy thing we had to do with that. We also had to go out as a team to some of the courts on the hustings to start looking at processes. Things like, how do you process fines and fees? How do you do that? To try to begin to develop the very initial beginnings of the computerization of those kind of things. It was very, very very green at that point. There wasn't anything final to it. When Baldwin came on, he was able to whip a bigger staff into place and to really start fashioning those things. So I would say, from the time I was hired until he came on, I was in a caretaker role of a lot of the things that were ongoing.
Did you use any model from other court systems to assist you?
If I did, I didn't know I was doing it at the time. It was an OJT. It was just sort of a handling by crisis of the moment. I mean, there wasn't anything that failed under my watch, but it was just literally going to the Committee on District Courts, which was mostly political in nature. I mean, made up, because they're the ones that fund the system, and saying, all right, we need to do this. What do you want us to do? That type thing, you know. They also functioned as the board of directors of the then system, and you know, they provided a lot of leadership to us in that role. But the model was just, okay, here's what we do, here's what we got to accomplish, do something to make it happen.
At any point during that period, did you find yourself overwhelmed?
I think I was a little bit on adrenaline at that point. Also, I was getting ready to get married, and I was dealing with personal situations as well. But I spent a lot of weekends working here, just because you couldn't get it all done in 5 days.
Mm-hmm. And did you have a number of people you were supervising?
Only one. We had at the time we had an IT person, kind of the computer person. We had a payroll person, 3 people. We had Mr. Bennett's staff of 4, who were mainly secretaries. And that was about it. We only had about 7 or 8 people at the time. It was very small.
And after Baldwin came in, what changed?
He was given the charge by the court, his boss, to do whatever he had to do to get it going. So he came in, and I think he struggled a little bit too, but he's a pretty masterful, organized guy. From his report, he describes himself as an ESTJ. He's, I don't want to say driven, but he is definitely got a big picture mentality. And he began using his staff to interact with the legislators, and I continued pretty much to be behind the scenes at that point, dealing with my responsibilities and dealing with coordination of staff, because the role of the assistant was to kind of be the chief of staff.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about your relationship with first with Bennett and then with Baldwin.
I felt at times I was like Bennett's son he never had, because he was comfortable with me sharing, and he was not much of a direction giver. He just sort of said, well, we need to get this done, and you need to do this, and you need to do that. I felt I was a confidant, and I felt like I made him a little more at ease about, yes, we can, yes, we will. And he felt a little relieved at that point to know that he had a little more energy to get things done. He was always very supportive. He wasn't one of these people that would call you in and give you a laundry list of things he wanted to accomplish. It would be more general, and he would let you know that this needed to be accomplished, and take care of this. Rob came in, not in a threatening way, but you definitely knew things were going to change. And so
Explain that.
by that, he had a master plan of what we had to do and what we were to do at the moment. He had to build his staff. So we had the continuum of the daily activities, but we also were thrown into the deep water of, okay, from this point on, we, the executive secretary, are going to have to develop this system or this system or this system, and we're going to have to be aggressive, and we're going to have to move quickly.
And so did you feel as if you did not have that confidant relationship, or it was simply different?
It was still a comfortable and fairly confident situation, but it was more in the military mode. We have a commander, and we have staff sections, and we have responsibilities, and we don't have time to sit around and talk war stories. We got time's burning here. Let's get going. Mm-hmm. It was never threatening, but you knew what your plate had before you to accomplish.
What kind of hours were you working?
Well, I had gotten married at that point, but I continued to do full weeks. Probably, I would say I averaged about 55 or 60 hours a week. I did a lot of weekend work, and also I was in the Army Reserves, and I had at least one and sometimes two weekends with that. So my new wife thought, am I ever going to see you? Because I was gone on the weekends a lot. But of course, when I was here, I was just coming in for the day or the night or something like that. But it was a sense of duty, but it was also the expectation, all right, there's what you got to do. He never micromanaged us, but he fully expected us to accomplish what we had to accomplish. Mm-hmm. Now, people were in different roles. I mean, I was more the office person, having a lot of staff things to do, versus the people in the IT who were out in the field trying to develop systems, or the training people were out, doing conferences and that stuff. Although I assisted with some of that.
Mm-hmm. Did you find any of your military training to be important?
Yes, I did. I found that you develop the ability to give orders and to expect results. The military model never came, we never were, as severe as the military model can be, I don't think, but it did give me a good feeling of the staff relationships and the chain of command.
Now, you saw the organization grow tremendously during this period. So what were some of the things that you had to do to not only accommodate this huge growth, but how did your role change?
My role changed in the sense that the executive secretary looked to me to do a lot of the coordination among staff members, just to make sure things were operating the way they would. I didn't have any command authority over any of that, but he looked to me to be sort of a focus point to make sure things. We had weekly staff meetings where he would be briefed, if you will. But there was also that designation thing that continued on. He looked to me to make sure all of that was done. And he also looked to me more and more through our careers as his sounding board for judge issues. That is to say, is not, Rob had the very political sensitive piece of it where he had to deal with the court and he had to deal with the legislature and he also had to deal with judges, but the role of judge can be a lonely one. They don't have anybody they can really rely on. So my job was to be a sounding board to them, be a person who would listen to what's going on in their world. If they got a problem, see if I can help that be worked out. And I think I got the reputation that I was the one the judges looked to if they needed to sound out something.
So what were some of the things that they would sound out to you?
Well, a lot of it had to do with the fact that we were perceived at that point as invading their world with all these new requirements. I just had to translate to them, no, this is what the legislature has required. We're not here to gobble you alive. We're here to be of assistance, but we've also been given the mission of, hearsay and gossip gets translated many ways, but just to say, if you need something, call me. I'll see if I can get it worked out for you. I'm having this problem. That type thing. Rob was so busy he couldn't spend a lot of time dealing with individual problems. He kind of left it to staff people, and me in particular to sort of be a translator of what's going on.
And so the judges would call you about what kinds of issues?
Well, particularly related to the cases I was assigning them, there would be some issue, or I would have to call them and say, I've got a special court I need a judge on, an annexation court. I've got a special court, it was a big capital murder case. The local judge cannot hear it. I need to put you in that role. I need to have a change of venue order issued. I was brokering cases all over the state.
That meant that you had to know a lot of judges.
I knew them all.
And
That was my job, to know them all.
How long did it take you to really get to know
Well, they
them?
kept growing. But I would get to know them when they would come to their pre-bench training. And I'm not saying I knew them all intimately, but I knew all of them. I also knew all the retired judges because I could use them in recall cases. So I made it my job to get to know them as well as I could and to make them understand that I was there to help them.
That meant that you had to have tremendous mental organization to know all these people, their different skills. How did you go about doing that?
I think that's a work in progress. I think as you get to deal with them over and over, you know more about them, and I can't say I could name all their grandchildren, but I knew enough about them that would help me to know who might be good on a special assignment, who not to put on a special assignment, because they're not all highly regarded. The Supreme Court is the one making the assignment, so I always wanted to do it in coordination with the court to make sure if it was a particularly sensitive case that I was getting who they wanted to be in that case.
So you had to have frequent meetings?
Yeah, I had conversations a lot with the Chief Justice.
Mm-hmm. Did the Chief Justice depend upon you to give them information about some of these judges?
If something came up in the context of that, I would let them know.
Did you keep lots of notes on these?
We kept what was called an assignment file. It's an order of the court, and I would have notes and things that would go along with that. But before the Supreme Court Chief Justice or assistant puts his name, they want to make sure the order is both accurate but reflects who it is they want to be on a case.
So is this something you created?
No, this was something that Mr. Bennett created and that I inherited the job to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so who were some of the Chief Justices that you worked with?
The gentleman I had my appointment with who hired me was a Justice Sneed, Harold Fleming Sneed. He was an interesting fellow. He was well regarded. He was had a laugh that would pierce a room. He was there in '73 when I came, and then he retired in, I believe, '75. And then The old system of Supreme Court Chief Justice was the senior in service. And the senior in service following Snead was Ianson. And Ianson served from 75 or 6 to about 81. And that's when Carrico came. He was always a justice. And he served from 81 to 2003. So the bulk of my time and Rob's time was with Carrico. But I do remember Snead, and I do remember Ianson, who was physically located in Portsmouth. And then Carrico. And then in 2003, the legislature changed the way Chief Justices were elected. They were then, I mean, the way they were appointed, they were then elected among their peer group. Mm-hmm. And Leroy Hassell became the Chief Justice in 2003.
What would you say was your relationship with these different Chief Justices? Did one have a particular way of doing things that was very different from the other? And I'm not trying to be really specific with my question, just trying to get you to tell me just a little bit about each of them.
My memory of Snead was that he was pretty much a day-to-day guy. My role with him was, under Bennett, was to do the orders, and pretty much I didn't interact with him a lot, except when he was chairing the Committee on District Courts at the time, and I would have to be a staff person to that. Ianson pretty much continued it. The only problem with Ianson was he was in Portsmouth. We had to get permission to either do the orders and have a stamp with his name on it, or occasionally I would have to run down to Portsmouth to get him to sign papers or something like that. The court's not in session every day, mm-hmm. Even now. They were here every 7th week, and we could get a lot done during the weeks, say Ianson was here. But otherwise, I'd have to depend on the telephone or a stamp or something like that. Carrico was here the whole time, and it was a continuum of interaction on the day-to-day, and particularly I got involved with him on designation orders, but he also, I assisted at educational training with our director of education. He was always there to give speeches, and so I was a staff person coordinating details for his, whatever he was doing at the time. Mm-hmm. I was not his, we use the military, aide de camp, but he depended on Rob Baldwin and me for, but the big policy stuff was through Baldwin, but some of the day-to-day things were through him. Hassell continued some of that, but then he's the new Chief Justice, and it was during the Hassell days that the staff that I knew was beginning to retire or leave, and he had a different way of doing things.
How was his way different than the others?
His way was different in that he took more of a frontline approach to handling things. He wanted to do a lot of the things the executive secretary did.
Mm. So he was much more involved.
Much more hands-on mm-hmm. with the day-to-day operations of our office.
Did that create any conflict?
We weren't always sure what he wanted.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be honest with you, I wasn't. But we continued to operate under his control, and when I say he wanted to be more involved, he wanted to just make sure that he had hands-on all the staff, what was going on, and he would pop in and say what's going on and that type thing. And I think we generally satisfied him, but he was more aggressive as far as dealing with the field. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Than the predecessors had been. The Carrico, for example, when the legislature came to town, he would go over and speak to the big chairman of the finance committees. That was the protocol thing to do, but he would then come back to his role as Chief Justice. Hassell began to wander the halls of the legislature, almost, I don't want to use the wrong term, more of a lobbyist. It raised eyebrows to some, but that wasn't my decision to make. But he, God bless him, he had a horrible ending. I'm so sorry for his demise. He got sick, but that was after I left. But the role of the chief, and not my role, changed a little bit with his becoming the chief.
So the lobbying perhaps was about the
Well, he was trying to get money for the court system.
Right.
That was done by a handshake with Carrico, but I mean, I think he got his people over there, and everybody was going to see legislators and everything. And maybe that's the way to do it. I don't know. The money's tight.
Was he successful?
For the most part, I think he was. And again, I had retired at that point, but I think he was able to keep the funding levels up. And there's always new judgeship requests, and that's always a political football. But I think he got more involved in the game to get more judgeships. But to some of the old legislators, that was maybe he was appearing too often over there. That's what I heard. But again, if he was successful, more power to him.
Now, your this whole new infrastructure included an educational component, and so can you tell me how that evolved and how you were involved?
In the days of Bennett 52 to when Baldwin came, or until I came, in 1973, there had been some conferences or training sessions, not big in scope, but there would be an annual gathering of the judges at a conference where they would talk about the business of the year. They would talk about some educational piece, that new laws or something like that. And I think that was pretty much in place. But when the Court Reorganization Act came, and we had all these new people, then we had the task of developing training models. I think that can pretty much fall on the Baldwin years, where the Director of Education's role expanded. So we had to have annual training for all levels of court, usually a general conference, and they would talk about updates in the law. They would talk about subject matter like capital murder, bring in learned people to do it. We hired people to do that in the beginning, and that was the era of grant monies, and so grants were paying for a lot of this. This was a new MO also, the era of the grants, and we also were able to get through grants security equipment, shields, walk-through scanners for the courts. So we were the sort of focal point for the money to get these to the courts. It was a big deal. And then the training model then morphed into certification training, where you are now getting all these new judges, and now you are, and we set up a pretty aggressive pre-bench training program, where the judges who were elected had to go through 3 weeks of training, and that involved simulation, court simulation things and models. So, I think we developed a pretty good educational training. I mean, so many judges I would meet at conferences from other states, they sort of get elected or appointed, they don't have any training. I mean, someone said, "Can you train a judge?" I said, "Yes, you can train a judge just like you can train everybody else." But, go back to William and Mary, we got the National Center for State Courts down there. We used a lot of their resources at William and Mary through the years.
And so what was your involvement?
My involvement in the education was more as an assistant and more of as a resource to help with staffing and to attend conferences and make sure things were being carried out. Occasionally I would be assigned to a committee to develop a program or something like that.
Now, you were also involved in writing a newsletter. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
This was an in-house production, nothing glossy professional, but as we grew as a staff, I think the decision was made that there ought to be some internal communication about goings on. It wasn't anything of a literary prose quality, but it was just like welcoming new people who may have left, birthdays, human interest type thing.
And whose idea was it to produce it?
I think it was staff idea. I mean, I think maybe it was one on our checkoff list of things we needed to do as a staff.
Mm-hmm.
Probably came out of a Baldwin list.
You also produced some things for people who were involved in domestic or juvenile court.
I'm trying to think. That was probably some of the forms things that came out of the early development. I was just a staff person on that. I remember going out to some of the courts to develop a model that was then initially adopted. I was assistant to that. Later on, I became the manager of another assignment to us was something called the Administrative Hearing Officer Program.
Mm-hmm.
And those are to use a school vernacular, those are the people who are hearing cases on IEPs, those type things. But administrative law is a distinct, and that's probably one area that I did kind of shine a little bit, administrative law. When we got the assignment of the hearing officer program, then I did help to develop training programs for that, and I probably was the guru, or at least the chief staff person assigned to handle that, and we had to do training on that.
When did that come about?
That came along later. I'm trying to think exactly when we took that over. It was in the 80s, sometime in the 80s.
So did Baldwin task you with doing that?
Yeah, Baldwin pretty much looked to me because he had enough on his plate, but he got involved, but as far as subject matter and all that, I think he looked to me as the chief staff person for that.
And that was something that you really enjoyed doing?
I did. Administrative law is sort of like watching paint dry, but it's got its own thing, and also I really began to sense the place of administrative law, particularly hearing officers' roles in dealing with school issues. Special ed, that type thing. I really did a lot of reading and research on that.
Why do you think you were attracted to that?
Well, I think it's probably getting me back to what I maybe should have done all my life in being in teaching or thinking about teaching, but it also gave me a view that not everybody was the valedictorian of the class, and there were special needs people, and there were processes that needed to be addressed to deal with that society of folks. I felt some gratification in seeing how that was handled.
Explain.
I was able to talk to hearing officers who did the cases and to learn through their conferences a lot of the cases that had gone on throughout the country where special issues were dealt with. Severely retarded or mildly retarded, but how services could be delivered to them. How do we get services to them? How can they be fulfilled? Not that I had any direct contact, but I at least was maybe facilitating the process to get due process to a class of people that normally I wouldn't have thought about until I got involved.
And were there any regions of Virginia where that was more effective?
It's a statewide program, so I don't know whether there's a model. There were certain cases that came out of particular areas, but you would deal with school systems from the very poorest to the very, and having a son myself who's gone through an IEP, he's not a special needs person, but he turned out in high school he was identified with a dyslexia sort of situation, So we had to go through the IEP and all that, and I was the parent sitting at the table with the school and the players, you know, and I learned firsthand what's involved in the process. And the schools obviously got a budget, and some of these awards that the judges have to give out are to special schools that cost the counties and the cities just humongous amounts of money. But that's just the way it is. I mean, it's under the law, under the title, that's the way it works. But that's the money is not the tool. It's just finding the right placement.
So as the infrastructure and your duties grew and expanded, did your hours grow as well?
Well, at that point, I was probably dropping back on hours. Not that I wasn't doing as much work, but you know, all the other staff sections are humming. So here I'm doing my designation work and my special project work, but I'm more or less in-house, and I'm not on the hook for developing the huge big picture thing. And at that point, you know, we've got the computer system in place, it's an evolving thing, we've got the educational training model set up, and so things are pretty much in the 90s until I retire, pretty much a day-to-day operation.
Now, of course, you were involved at the time that the whole system was starting to be computerized.
Right.
What kinds of challenges did you personally face with that?
Well, and not being a computer person, I really didn't have any challenges with that. Except for the field, moaning and groaning and trying to, you know, put out the fires out there, but we rely pretty much on our computer staff and the people that were doing our planning for that. I couldn't answer any technical questions or anything like that, but I could say to them, you know, hang with us. This is going to take a while. We'll all get through it together.
You had to obviously learn how to use the computer.
Yes. Now the computer I was able to master. I'm not a gee whiz kind of person, but day-to-day operation I was able to do the computer.
And how long did it take you?
Probably over time about a week, full time. It was always changing, but we had to learn how to, you know, do the monumental thing. We had to go from, you know, pretty much selector typewriters to computers.
But there was also a transition in how information was communicated by the judges, by the courts. And so wasn't your office involved in creating the protocols for that?
Yes, yes. Again, that would have fallen not so much to me, but as to Rob Baldwin and his team that was dealing with that. We had some IBM studies and some other things, but I wasn't the one signing off on any of that. But yes, it was a work in progress for a number of years. And it's a big system.
Right. Now, your interaction with the judges and making suggestions and recommendations about which judges to use for different kinds of cases. Did this also lead you to interacting with some of the politicians in the state?
Yes. Rob was the primary on that because of the Committee on District Courts and the Judicial Council. I was a backup to that. I would mainly see those people at meetings in-house where they were there for conferences. I would be an assistant. Rob was leading the effort to either sell or to explain. But I was there to run errands or to be assigned to a particular person to get him, I'm talking about a legislator, to get him information about something he wanted to know. I had to do research type thing.
So how much did you learn through
Just
that?
through listening, I learned a lot. I didn't learn enough to be technically proficient. I mean, I could understand what they were saying was going to be happening, but I didn't have any day-to-day at the computer assessing what was coming off of that. You know, I wasn't up in the big room with all the computers that were, you know, spitting out the information.
But I was thinking in terms of your interaction with some of the politicians.
Oh, some of the politicians, it was mainly at a conversational level, just to tell them that I'm there, I'm involved in this part of it. Do you need me to get you any information? How can I help? It was more to assist than to advise.
But through this, did you learn the politics of Virginia?
Yes, I did.
And tell me a little bit.
I knew about the politics, I think, before all this. Particularly in the early days, we had politicians, good people, but they were used to running the system. And the court was another branch of government, and all of a sudden they're put in a situation where they are calling the shots for the courts. And so you had to be very beholden to them. I think Rob's transcript says he got in hot water and, you know, he came in with all these fresh ideas, but you had to learn, practically speaking, you know, that don't go beat up Baldwin, but he had to learn the hard way. When you're dealing with politicians, I think you just have to soft sell what you're trying to do and be deferential a little bit because they're the funding agency. So I learned early, I think, that you had to deal behind the scenes in a professional way, but you weren't the one giving the orders. You couldn't be the one giving the orders. And that's why I think I was maybe helpful to Rob, because they would maybe get irritated with him, but they'd call me and say, okay, he needs to understand. And he understood. But, you know, we need this or we need that. And I had to be both supportive of him, which I was, but I also had to listen to them because I understood they were the ones writing the checks. And he worked out over time. He was able to figure it out. But the approach at the beginning to go in and start telling them we're going to do this, this, and this was more, okay, we need to do this, this, and this. What do we need to do? You tell us. And the fear in the court system was, in hearsay, was this office in Richmond is now going to start running our show and telling us what to do. We're not used to that. The Bennett approach had been just to kind of say, don't worry about it, it'll work out. But we still had to keep the field satisfied that we weren't the behemoth that they thought we were. So I think a lot of my discussions with judges and people and the clerks was, you know, hey, we're not bad guys. We're been tasked with this. We're doing the best we can. We need your help. We need your help.
So you were perhaps more of the diplomat?
Those are your words. I probably was a little more diplomatic in the sense of knowing why I knew more about the system he did. He came in as an academician, very smart guy, lots of good ideas. I had ideas, but I realized, practically speaking, you got to get the bees with the honey more than with the molasses, or more with the vinegar. But I don't know. I think I was just a listening post, hopefully a good one.
Do you think that your experiences with community work helped with that at all?
I think that, and some of the military. I think in learning to deal with people, and learning to see the other side, and without an agenda per se, you know. I think I've always been fairly communicative, and I've liked to deal with people. And I felt my role with judges was particularly as a listener, because, as I said at the beginning, I found out over time they had a lonely judge. Once they become a judge, they're kind of divorced from the legal community. They can't be buddy-buddies with their old law friends. They've got to be separate and apart and neutral. And sometimes they have bad days, and they just want to talk to somebody. Hey, I need to talk to you, or I had a bad day. And somebody could listen to them. And I couldn't maybe always solve their problems, but I would empathize. I think empathy is maybe a quality I'd have.
Do you think you learned that from anyone or simply developed that?
I think I developed that over time. I think my grandfather on my mother's side was a guy, Mr. Sam they called him, who always knew everybody, always wanted to know what was going on. How can I help you?
When you look back at your time as the assistant, what do you think your legacy was?
I think my legacy was that I was a friend. I was someone people could depend on. I was there to do the job. I wanted things to work out as well as they could under the circumstances. And that as to the judges and to the field, that I was perceived as someone they could call upon when needed for helping them with a matter or to assist them in some way that would make their job easier. I always wanted to be remembered as somebody who had a good relationship with the people I dealt with and that was seen to have the qualities of honesty, integrity, and goodwill.
And looking back over those 33 years, what was perhaps the most challenging part of your job or situation that happened?
Probably the most challenging part was to feel that I was adequate to the task that had been assigned me. In other words, there was this feeling a little bit at the beginning that, I didn't become the executive secretary, so what is my role? And I was allowed the opportunity to create it. But there was always my worry that, have I measured up? Have I done what I'm supposed to do as well as I'm supposed to do it? And I didn't feel inadequate for the job. I just never had a true feeling until the very end that, hey, maybe you've done okay. You've done fine. There's not, I think we got positive strokes all along the line, but it's kind of what it could have been. And maybe I came to the conclusion, hey, I should not have been the executive secretary. I think I actually ended up where I needed to be, and I developed that office the best I could. And inadequate, I never really felt totally, but there was always this lingering question in my mind, okay, now you've been given this job, did you do it fine? When you retire, can you go out with your head held high? And I did.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any of your favorite, most humorous stories of any interaction that you had with any judges or staff members over the 33 years?
Staff, I will never forget Rob Baldwin's 40th birthday. We did a skit down in the Supreme Court. And we all played parts, and it was kind of who's that? We brought his parents in from Roanoke, and we had people behind the curtain. Who is this? And he didn't even recognize his mother's name, her voice. But Rob's a good-looking guy, and he's always, the big joke with Rob was his hair, and that he would have the perpetual same hair the rest of his life, whereas most of us were losing hair at the time. So he was given a lifetime supply of VO5. I'll never forget that. There are many judge stories I could tell you, but some of the judges that I remember well were some of the old-time judges who would tell me war stories about becoming a judge and some of their career things. I think I would remember, if I had time, I would write a book about interesting judges I have known through my life. And there are too many to recount here, but I think I just had the pleasure of sharing with them some of their life stories and some of the cases that they had. And I felt like I was almost I could be a storyteller on some of that. And also clerks of the court. There's some good stories and bad stories about judges and clerks. We had judges through the years who got in trouble. And I didn't tell you at the beginning, but I had the first assignment I had was with the Judicial Inquiry and Review Commission before it became a spin-off office. But in my early career, I had to sit through it was private, but it was a judge who got called up on a matter and who ended up losing his retirement. And I'm sitting in there with the court reporter and the attorneys, and this is a man who's served 30 years on the bench, and his life is on the line in terms of his career, and I'm just wide-eyed that this could actually happen, and it was happening. I guess that was a real growing up period. Mm-hmm. I can't talk a lot about the case because that's all confidential, but it's just, it was a new thing to me. Mm-hmm. But some of the judges, would love to, one or two judges got in trouble for DUI or whatever. But the good stories about the judges are about them talking about a case or something that happened in their family, and or a clerk of the court, talking about, the circuit clerks are elected, so they're not quite in the system, they're halfway in the system. Mm-hmm. But just, I guess, getting to know the judges and the clerks and the magistrates as friends, who I could continue to call as friends over time. It was like they were willing, I guess I was somebody they felt comfortable sharing with. Of course, this wasn't broadcast to the world, but it was just like, hey, I want to talk about this, or whatever. And I had a few cases during the years special cases where a judge's spouse or children would get in trouble, and we'd have to find special judges to hear their cases. So I interacted both on the judicial level, also on the family level, mm-hmm. trying to get the fairest result for them.
So that's actually your next adventure, is to writing this down, writing a book.
I wish I could. I've gotten real busy in retirement with some other issues. If you're interested, I do a little substitute teaching. I have been hired back to the legislature during session to the clerk, but the really big thing is I have been appointed a civil marriage celebrant. I do weddings. Unlike what the magistrates used to do.
What got
I had
you?
2 on Sunday. I've got 1 Friday, and I got 1 Saturday.
What got you into that?
After I retired, I was at church one day with the clerk of the court in Hanover, where I live. He's a friend, and he said, "What are you going to do in retirement?" I said, "I'll figure out something." I hadn't quite figured that out yet. So he said, "Well, we'd like to ask if you'd be willing to be a marriage commissioner." And he even made a joke because my wife's a big flower person. He said, "Why don't you do the weddings, and your wife, we can get you we'll get you a vehicle with a trailer on it, and she can put a trellis on it, and you all can just do Vegas. We can just ride around the county doing weddings." And that didn't happen. But he said, "Would you be willing to be appointed as a marriage commissioner?" And some other things were going on in the magistrate area, who used to do it. They've now required magistrates to be lawyers to be appointed magistrates. And of course, I was a lawyer, and so I took on the assignment. And it's now I'm on the list, and I can do any Virginia license, and I get calls all the time. And we don't do the trellis, but I do a lot of weddings, and I do a lot of them up in Hanover, where I'm living at the famous historic. Talking about history, you ought to come up there, give you a tour of the historic courthouse in Hanover, which is Patrick Henry's courthouse. Patrick Henry, go back in time, learned his law at William and Mary under George Wythe. That's a whole nother thing. But anyway, I do weddings.
What?
And I don't have a lot of time to write, but I've had several clerks talk to me and said, we ought to sit down and write a book about funny things. There are too many funny ones to go over, but you know, there's some funny anecdotal things.
Do you remember one that you can give us?
Well, I remember one judge got in trouble with it, who was hearing a case up in a court on a special assignment, and it was a pretty bad case. It was a rape case, and it was going on and on and on, and it got to be 5 o'clock in the day, and he adjourned court rather than going on. And the reporter asked him, why did you adjourn the court? It was 5 o'clock. He said, well, I'm on assignment from the Supreme Court, but I answer to a higher authority, my wife. Time to go home. Stuff like that. And that made the newspaper, and oh God. And of course, we had made the assignment, so I get called, what do you mean about that judge, giving up the case? I have no control of the case once it's given to him. That's his judge thing. That's just one funny clerk story, if you got time. There was a clerk in the county not far from here who was he was a clerk of the circuit court, elected, but he was a farmer. And unfortunately for that clerk, he got a little bit of financial problem and just borrowed some money from one of the trust accounts, was going to pay it back. Unfortunately, somebody under the will came in to collect their bequest, and he realized he had a problem. And so he got a check that he had holding from another account, wrote it over to the bequest person, and the person went down to the local bank to cash the check. The bank teller was the wife of a state policeman, realized this was not a good check. The poor clerk ended up having to resign. But I mean, there's stories like this that, if I could recall them all, that through time, you could build a book.
Well, what made you decide to retire?
My stepmother was in ill health. I was dealing with a lot of health-related issues, long distance. I had 33 years in. The new Chief Justice was, most of the staff I worked with had retired or gone, and he thought that maybe, I thought that maybe it was time for me to go on because he was assembling a new staff, and I felt like, well, maybe my time is gone. Maybe it's time to do it. 33 years. I'm 62. I'm not that old, but I think I can maybe find something else I can do.
So looking back over the 33 years, I asked you about the legacy issue, but in a sentence or two, what is it that you would like for someone to write about your contributions to the court?
Fred Hodnett is an attorney who found his way to the court system in Virginia by way of invitation to be part of the administrative staff of the Supreme Court. And he took the opportunity to find a career that invested him in the things he liked most doing, and that is in dealing with people and using his law experience, training, and his love of government to bring together those features that made him a hopefully complete person.
Well, thank you so much.